It's 6 o'clock in London, 1 p.m. in New York, also 1 p.m. in Miami, where I am today, 1 a.m. in Hong Kong, 3 a.m. in Sydney, 10 a.m. in San Francisco, and 10:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Patrick L. Young. The IPO-VID livestream, Series 19, Episode 3, that's Episode 111, starts here. The London Metals Exchange, it's a big week in court for them as the nickel nightmare comes to trial. Major concerns remain about possible SRO, self-regulatory organisational boundary issues for all the London exchanges, depending on what's happening. Meanwhile, no sooner was London's biggest IPO of the year announced than Wee Soda disappeared in a puff of investor lethargy, as a public listing that is. Free markets need investors. They are absent in the London Stock Exchange Group as the big data play loses market focus. Meanwhile, China moves closer to another day, another $9 billion IPO raise in the form of Syngenta, with a market cap expectation of $60 billion. Meanwhile, in Creditors' Corner, one wonders how Arawak X can expect to go public in Q2 2025 while still owing considerable sums to their creditors. Parishioners are warned to avoid this enterprise. And finally, for the opening remarks today, Hong Kong exchanges, the dual counter lives. You can now trade your stocks on the Hong Kong exchange in Hong Kong dollars or Chinese RMB. What a stock connect, ladies and gentlemen. It's one small step between stock counters, providing a giant leap for stock trading, as Exchange Invest noted this week. Our guest today, ladies and gentlemen, is the magnificent Eamonn Butler. The topic is Adam Smith, 300 years on. Dr. Eamonn Butler is director and co-founder of the Adam Smith Institute, one of the world's leading policy think tanks, which promotes a free society and free economy. He has received many rewards in recognition of his work, including the UK National Free Enterprise Award. His book, Foundations of a Free Society, has been translated into more than 30 languages and is winner of the Fisher Award. He's author of other books on capitalism, markets, Magna Carta, trade, inequality, and free market economists such as Milton Friedman and, of course, Adam Smith. Eamonn commissioned and raised the statue of Adam Smith, which stands in Edinburgh's High Street, and received an honorary degree from the Edinburgh Business School in recognition of this and his other achievements. Eamonn, welcome to the show. Where in the world are you today?
Thank you very much indeed. Good to be here. Well, I'm in sunny Westminster in London, just around the corner from the Houses of Parliament, or as we say, within spitting distance of the Houses of Parliament.
Yes, well, with the mood in Westminster these days, one doesn't wish to incite, but on the other hand, that distance could certainly be something that people might actively feel in terms of expectorating a little bit of phlegm in the direction of the somewhat discredited UK Parliament at the moment, but maybe I'm just suggesting my own political views there. Very good to have you on the show. Tell me, how did you come to found the Adam Smith Institute?
Well, colleagues and I in the 1970s, we were all at university at Scotland. And in the early to mid 1970s, the UK economy was going south at a rate of knots. And many of us did what many of our colleagues did, and we joined the brain drain and went to America to make our fortune there. But while we were in America, we saw interesting ideas that, like they had competition in telephones, for example, which I was taught by my economics professor at St. Andrews that it was theoretically impossible. And then similarly, the Americans were talking about having a national health service, and we knew that that was a disaster in the UK. So the three of us all came back and decided that we would spend our time swapping ideas across the Atlantic, and we founded the Adam Smith Institute. But then very shortly afterwards, Mrs. Thatcher came into office, so we had a bit of an own goal here. And that's really been our focus ever since, is focused on UK policy, although UK policy on things like privatization that we've worked on obviously has importance around the world.
It's very interesting to compare. That 1970s period, I think people have forgotten. I can remember as a child myself being highly dysfunctional, and we were supposedly in the free world, but it was sometimes quite difficult to tell. It is an incredible leap that was made during the Thatcher-Reagan era, during the 1980s. How did you then interact with that period from the Adam Smith Institute?
Well, I think we were focused principally on the UK. We did actually start an office in the United States, but it's very difficult to run a think tank by wire because the issues are different in each country and you need different solutions in each country. And something that works in the UK wouldn't necessarily work in the United States. You've got to adapt it. So we didn't really last with that enterprise very long. We focused in our own country. And I think that's what most think tanks around the planet do. But there's more and more think tanks now promoting the free market message in all corners of the world. So that is good. And there's some in America and Canada and South America as well as in Asia and even Africa and of course here in Europe.
Well, it is. I mean, it's a very interesting time for the think tanks, but it does feel a little bit as if we're having to defend free markets the world over, or is that just my thinking?
No, that's absolutely right. What really is damaging to free market ideology is crises, because when you have a crisis or some sort of emergency, governments throw money at it, and then they say, "Oh well, we threw money at this, and we got through it. We got through the war. We got through the pandemic. We got through whatever it is, and therefore we should carry on throwing more money at problems. And if we win the war, we can win the peace." And so emergencies and things like the pandemic have been really damaging for the free market cause. It's a real problem. It's one which F.A. Hayek, the Nobel economist, pointed to many years ago.
And how do you feel at the moment, I mean, in terms of the European Union? I mean, obviously, I don't want to rerun the Brexit debate, but do you feel that the European Union has been helping overall the European continent, or do you try to keep out of that these days because you're in the UK?
Well, I think everybody in Britain tries to keep out of it as much as possible. When I was a student, I was actually pro-European, and I was treasurer of the Young European Federalists, in fact. But what we were trying to sign ourselves up for there was really a customs union, a free trade union. And over the years, it's developed into much more of a political project. So I think the turning point was somewhere in the Blair years when he signed Britain up to the social chapter and various other employment legislation. And they've always talked about harmonization, and some people were even talking about joining the euro. And that to me was horrible. That's the antithesis of a free market paradise. That's a European superstate, and we didn't really want to be part of that. And I think that's part of the reason why the UK voted for Brexit. The only trouble is, of course, that the politicians haven't done very much to, if anything, to capture the gains of that independence. And so we still have lots of regulation. We're still governed by European regulation in some places. Northern Ireland is part of the European Customs Union, not part of the UK. So it's really been a bit of a mess, and I think we should get on with Brexit and do it.
Yes, I must say, coming from Northern Ireland, I feel very aggrieved at what I refer to as the Belfast-Congo solution, where Brussels seems to have more control of Northern Ireland than the UK government does, which I definitely don't think was part of any plan at any point in any peace treaty or any other agreement in the troubled history of Northern Ireland over the course of the last century. Let me just say also, and as an aside, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, Peter Secon. Lovely to see you. I hope you're on the couch at home watching with Ari today. It's lovely to see you. Glad to see you. If you've got a question about anything this evening, of course, do feel free to put them to our guest, Eamonn, who is the primus modus operator of the Adam Smith Institute. And that brings us to the point, Adam Smith, 300 years young, just a couple of weeks ago. Tell us a little bit about the background to Adam Smith and how he became so significant.
Well, he started life as a moral philosopher, and he wrote a book which was thought to be brilliant at the time on moral philosophy called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And because it was so sensational, he was promptly headhunted, and he became tutor to a young aristocrat who he took on the grand tour of Europe. And then when he was over in Europe, he spoke to many of the intellectuals there, and he saw lots of interesting economic phenomena which didn't occur in the UK. And he then started writing a book on economics. And that was really the origin of The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776. And that is really the book that everybody remembers today. And it's a great tour de force. It's a defense of free trade and free commerce, and against the interventionism of the time. And so that's really one of the reasons why we chose the name of Adam Smith when we were starting the Adam Smith Institute, because everybody knows roughly what Adam Smith stands for.
So he's really, I mean, many people tout him as the father of modern day economics, and certainly there had been a number of people before him who'd been writing economic treatises. Oh, yeah. And again, they all came out of other areas because there wasn't really a speciality of economics per se, or at least not as I see it. Whether it be somebody like Copernicus, for example, who a few centuries earlier had knocked out a couple of interesting treatises on money and so on. In terms of Adam Smith himself, was he shaped more by his origins in Scotland and his surroundings there, or by this grand tour trip?
Oh, I think definitely his origins in Scotland. I mean, he was born in Kirkcaldy, which is on the east coast. It was a small trading town, not a very wealthy one, because trade was moving westwards to the Americas. And then he was very gifted, and he went at the age of 12 or 14 up to the University of Glasgow, and things there were completely different. It was a very thriving merchant town, and so he began to understand the commerce and trade and the importance of freedom in both of those things. And another, I think, interesting episode in his life was he went on from Glasgow to take up a scholarship at Balliol College in Oxford, where he noticed that the professors got paid whether they taught or not. So he famously wrote that the professors in Oxford have given up even the pretense of teaching because they get paid anyway. So I think that was an important lesson in incentives, which of course runs right through his work. So yes, I think by the time he had finished his earlier book, the moral philosophy book, I think he was already thinking about doing something in economics. He's really neither an economist nor a moral philosopher. He's a social psychologist. He's looking at the mind of human beings, and there are different facets of those. They engage in commerce, but they're also nice to each other, and they respect morality and so on. And I think he was probably going to do another book on politics and possibly another one on something else. So yes, he was really looking at the human mind rather than looking at economics as such.
Yes, it's interesting how people who become famous for these particular one work as they go along. Copernicus, again, being a good example. I think he was a remarkable polyglot as well, much like Smith in so many respects. And it's a fascinating issue because you mentioned the fact he came from Kirkcaldy. You mentioned the fact that the Kirkcaldy economy, while it was benefiting from the birth of the Industrial Revolution around it, it wasn't at the same time really a hotbed of growth because it was actually oriented in the wrong direction because the world at that stage was all moving west. How much of an impact do you think the economy of Scotland had on Smith? Because let's face it, not that long before he was born, within the century before he was born, there were still Scotsmen all exporting themselves to the Baltic republics because they were absolutely the places to be at that point in time in economic growth terms, 100 or so years before the Industrial Revolution took off.
Yes, I think the economy of Scotland, as I said, the two different halves, Kirkcaldy and Glasgow, and the difference between them, certainly did make an impression on him. But then when he went down to Oxford, it was a whole month on horseback to go from Kirkcaldy down to Oxford. There again, he couldn't believe how fat the cattle were in the fields and things like that, and how much the prosperity was, and the fabulous buildings and so on. So the wealth of England certainly impressed him. So I think that's probably the start of when he started to think about, well, what is it that makes countries rich or not so rich? And that's the title of his book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations.
And obviously that's quite fascinating, because he came up with so many intriguing concepts that remain with us today. I mean, the invisible hand is obviously the first one I can think of, but I'm sure there are multiple more you can add to the conversation.
Well, just read the first page of the Wealth of Nations, the first paragraph even. It says, basically, the wealth of a nation is not the amount of money that it has in its bank vaults. It's the product of its people. Okay, and you think, wow, here we are in paragraph 1, and this guy has invented the concept of gross national product.
Yeah.
And then in the next paragraph, he says, of course, it depends how many people live in the country. And you think, oh, right, so now he's got gross national product per capita. And then he says, well, and of course, some people don't work at all. They're too old, or they're too young, or some people can only work a little. And that also affects the product of the nation. And then you think, gosh, he's got the idea of productivity. So here you are in one page. He's got these 3 essential concepts that we still use today. So it really was a path-breaking book, but there's so much in it on trade and specialization and the problems with regulation and how markets help the poor. So pick any of those.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating, because looking back on the book 300 years on, or nearly 300 years since the book was published itself, but it is amazing how pertinent he remains in the overall factor of economics to this day. But then it also, I suppose, raises the interesting challenge, which I suppose he as a human psychologist would have been interested in himself, or social psychologist. Just why is it that more politicians don't seem to accept more of the things that he said in his book?
Well, you have to turn to the public choice economists, on which I've also written a book, Jim Buchanan and people like that, the Nobel economists, to see how the political system actually works. And what they say is that, well, don't imagine that politicians and officials are angels and they only do things for the public interest. They've got their own interests. They've got their interests that they want to keep their own party members sweet. So they will steer public spending in the direction of their own supporters and away from their opponents. And you see that all the time in America. It's got to outrageous levels. And also when they get into office, it's a case of, well, you vote for my measure and I'll vote for yours. So we all vote for each other's measure in Congress or in Parliament. And we therefore get far more legislation than any of us really want. And then when laws go down to officials, their interest is in making them as complicated as possible so that their offices expand and their salaries expand, and to make it so that they control things and they have the power. So you end up with legislation that's extremely complicated, and regulation under that, which is even more complicated, and nobody can understand it, and the parliamentarians can't even read the regulations, never mind understand what they are.
Yes, it's quite incredible. You look at the complexity of regulation these days, and again, I mean, that's something Smith was very eager to talk about, was the dangers of protectionism, regulatory protectionism, and so on. How do you think his position would be today when he looked at, say, for example, world trade and globalization?
Well, I think he would be delighted by globalization and very worried by the protectionism which has arisen, particularly since the pandemic, when so many people were saying, oh dear, all of our personal protective equipment is coming from China, various other things coming from China, we've got very dependent on China. Perhaps we should start making all of these things ourselves. I think Smith would say, well, just watch it, because what you should be doing is to make sure that you've got competing sources of supply, that if you fall out with one supplier, then you can go to other people. Not that you have to do everything yourself. He was a great believer in specialization. This is the division of labor idea, and that by specializing and trading, we make ourselves far richer than we could trying to do everything ourselves. He takes the example of a pin factory where he says, a dozen people, each specialized, one draws out the wire, one shapes the wire, one sharpens the point, one puts the head on, all different operations, and they're extremely good and skilled at doing all of those things, and that they can produce tens of thousands of pins a day. If you or I tried to produce a pin on our own, I think we couldn't really produce one a day, never mind 40,000 or whatever it is.
Yep.
So the specialization to him was extremely important, and therefore globalization remains very important. And I do hope that world trade gets back on its course pretty soon.
Yes, it's fascinating. I always love that YouTube video. The name of the man who made it, I can't recall, who decided to make himself a chicken sandwich. The bit where he was on the beach panning his salt being a particular highlight at one point in time, trying to manage to make the bread, growing the wheat, you name it, growing the chickens, etc., etc. And specialization is something we take incredibly, we ignore at our peril to this day. But it's also very interesting because, I mean, Adam Smith's obviously recognized these days as sort of the father of sort of free market economics and so on. And that brings us very elegantly to our book of the week, which is in fact The Wealth of Nations. And as you know, ladies and gentlemen, in response to readers' queries within Exchange Invest, we've been adding a book of the week column to the EI Weekend Edition. The EI Weekend Edition is a more macro read, and you can sign up for that for free at exchangeinvest.com. Incidentally, to coincide with this 300th anniversary of Adam Smith's birth, we're highlighting his masterpiece, The Wealth of Nations, which endured, I mean, it's quite incredible to think about this, Eamonn, a 17-year gestation period, including extensive conversations with contemporary economists such as Nicholas Magins. And people are complaining about Boris Johnson's various books being only a few years late. But anyway, enough of Boris Johnson. I mean, the result, it really is a masterpiece. I've got to say, I think it's a great book. And I mean, I still actually think it is a good read. I mean, yes, a lot of the language may be somewhat off for several centuries later, but on the other hand, so much of it's very, very pithy. And I think The Wealth of Nations does for economics what Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason achieved for philosophy in many ways. I mean, it really puts the whole concept of economics and economic interaction onto the map. So that's our book of the week, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here talking about the wonders of Adam Smith 300 years on with the head of the Adam Smith Institute from London, Dr. Eamonn Butler. Eamonn, when you look at this, I mean, a lot of people talk about Adam Smith and they say, oh, he's the father of free market economics. But it's quite interesting because in the same way that it seems that there's always this attitude towards free marketeers that they're cruel and we boil their own mothers for the bones or something, there's a lot of evidence that Adam Smith was actually a very, very generous and considerate person.
Yes, I think Adam Smith believed in free markets partly for the same reason that I do, which is that they're the best way to help the working poor. Mm-hmm. He believed that free markets were efficient and free trade was very, very efficient, and that was the way forward. But he also believed that the current system of his time, and actually the system that we have now, suppresses poorer people because, think of all these regulations we've just talked about. Where do they come from? They don't come from poor people. They don't come from new businesses. They come from old businesses that are established. People who have lobbyists and can sidle up to politicians and say, well, Minister, it would be really nice if you tweaked this regulation just a little bit. The public would be very much safer and better off. What they mean is, well, tweak that regulation a little bit and then I'll be able to keep out the competition because they won't be able to afford to obey the regulation. So, Smith was very much concerned with the plight of poorer people. And he believed that markets were the best way to get cheap goods to the maximum number of people possible so that poorer people could afford things, but also that in a free market, people could use their own talents in any way they chose. And they could indulge in what he called the natural disposition to better your condition. So that's really why he's in favor of free markets. And I think that's really why I'm in favor of free markets. And he writes about, a country can't be considered to be wealthy if the greater majority of its members are desperately poor. So he was very keen to introduce a system that would benefit the poor more than the rich. You know, I'm not in this fight for the rich. They can look after themselves. You guys can look after yourselves.
You know, but it's a very good point. I mean, he was very keen on social mobility and raising all boats, as effectively he raised the tide. And we had a great comment there from Mark Wheatley, coming to us from the city of London. Good to see Mark is, of course, our common councilman, but speaking in his own voice this evening. Plus, you know, the competing sources of supply in Southeast Asia could help rebalance the geopolitical dynamics slightly, a counterweight to People's Republic of China ties. Yes, a very elegant point about the globalization issue. Thank you very much, Mark, for your comment this evening. Great to see you. So tell me something about Adam Smith, because I mean, at the time of his heyday, this was really an amazing moment in the history of Edinburgh. I mean, it was the Enlightenment. It was probably the greatest, I don't know, how might one put it, corralling of intellectual minds in Scotland into Edinburgh and Glasgow in history, even though the Scottish National Party would doubtless beg to differ with the modern age. But nonetheless, I mean, it was certainly a very, very interesting time, so much going on. How was Smith interacting with the great men of science, both in Scotland and England, at the time of his peak?
Oh, I think he knew them all and they all knew him. Scotland really started to rise after the Act of Union of 1707, because then trade with England became easier, movement between Scotland and England became much easier. So people did go south to see what England was all about, and English people went to Scotland to see what Scotland was all about. And it was like what Daniel Burstein calls the cultural frontier, that you go to somewhere that's foreign, as England and Scotland were foreign countries almost to each other at the time. You go somewhere foreign and you see things and you think, wow, that's a good way of doing things. Or you see things and you think, gosh, I could improve on that. And you spark ideas of people in other places. And I think that was exactly the same thing was happening in Scotland and in England. And when he was writing The Wealth of Nations, Smith spent about 3 years in England, and he talked to everybody that there was to talk to there, Dr. Johnson and Joshua Reynolds and, you know, who else. And in Edinburgh, he talked to Hume, David Hume, and Ferguson, Adam Ferguson, and other great minds of the age. So the Scottish Enlightenment was really, you know, something really quite incredible, and it really put Scotland on the map, and it really brought Scots to England, and the English had to sort of take account of Scotland for a change. Yeah.
Yes, it's really, really fascinating. So was he himself in any way dabbling in science, or did he stay more to his particular areas of interest in the human condition?
He did write a long essay on the history of science, which is really, he calls it the history of science, but it's really a treatise on scientific method. And it's Popperian. It's like Karl Popper, basically, that he says science is a matter of trial and error. You have a theory and you test it, and if it's wrong, you adjust it or abandon it and try another theory. So he was really quite far ahead in that. I'm not sure that he ever really took a huge interest in science. He was more interested, I think, in public affairs. He was active politically. He was a Rockingham Whig, as they called them. In other words, a reformer, not a conservative, and in world affairs. And I think he probably, we don't have any specific evidence, but he almost certainly met Ben Franklin when they were both in London. And he talked to other political leaders in France and Switzerland. So yes, he was involved in all of these things. Not really so much in science, although he did have an amazing library, and it does include many works of science.
It's very, very interesting, his whole approach and the holistic nature of what went on in those days, particularly in this modern age of so-called enlightenment, where everybody spends years at university and seems to come out pretty much stupider than they went in my opinion. Certainly it doesn't seem to do a great deal of additive work compared to the gentlemen of the Enlightenment who just stayed home, dealt with their libraries and met other people around and about and learned a great deal. Quite fascinating. So what about, I mean, obviously here we are, you know, IPO-VID, we're all interested in free markets and particularly actually the stock markets, commodity markets and so on. How much interaction did Smith and his books and his theories have with the workings of stock and commodity markets, and what did he think of them?
I think that, well, his work had a profound impact on the politics by which these things are governed. You know, for example, he was, after the Wealth of Nations, he was taken on as a tax advisor. And he wrote a tax plan which William Pitt the Younger, when Prime Minister, pretty much put into effect. And similarly with trade, he advocated trade with America. You know, even though UK was at war, Britain was at war with America. So his influence, I think, was really on the political level. And it was effective because we had Smithian tax policies and we had Smithian trade policies. And that really led to the great 19th century era of free trade, by which prosperity in Britain and America and many other countries that were part of it just increased hugely, just as globalization in the 80s and 90s onwards in particular enriched places all over the globe that hadn't really been touched by markets before. So I think he's helped make the world very much more sophisticated in terms of finance and capital and indeed trade.
Yes, it's interesting, although I mean, he thought about so many of these things. He was so influential at the political level. Was he himself actively involved in trade or in entrepreneurship or in investment?
No. He was very much a absent-minded professor, and he was a very likable man. But he just spent all his time thinking and arguing, and he liked a good argument. Which is why he was a member of many clubs, which is where men went to discuss world affairs, and indeed he helped found a couple of clubs as well. Other than that, he was very much of an academic and slightly absent-minded. It's said that you know, he would get engrossed in some sort of problem and thinking about it. And one time he was thinking about it and walked out of the house still in his dressing gown, and only realized that he'd done that after he walked 10 miles and heard the church bells of the next village. So he was, you know, he was that sort of a person. But while he was writing the Wealth of Nations, yes, he did interview. He did go to see factories like the pin factory and discuss economics with business people. So he had a pretty good business background from that, I suppose. Yes.
Yes, very interesting how his thinking went, and yeah, the ability to be so wrapped up in his thoughts as to be able to walk 10 miles, and not something that would happen these days. I don't think anybody walk 10 miles these days.
He also fell into a tanning pit because he wasn't looking where he was going and things like that. So yes,
that's a very unfortunate thing to walk into. That's most unpleasant. Yes. Something that definitely wouldn't work on many levels. So, I mean, the legacy of Smith, I mean, it's massive in that he's obviously a single man brand name who's famous pretty much throughout the world in economics. What do you think are the key facets of his legacy that live with us to this day?
Well, I think plainly the importance of free trade. Nearly all economists argue for free trade. Politicians don't always do that because there are political interests that stop them from doing it. But economists will all tell you, yes, free trade is a good thing. It enriches both sides. People didn't know that in the 18th century. They assumed that the only person to come out well of a trade was the person who ended up with the money. They forgot that other people ended up with the goods. So trade certainly is an important lesson for today. Specialization, again, similarly, is very important, and that means allowing people to specialize, not regulating them out of existence, and not trying to resist international trade through protectionism. That's very important. He believed in an important but limited role for government. He thought that government could not control an entire economy, and so they might as well not bother trying. And that mostly governments were simply used by vested interests in order to promote their own interests rather than to promote the interests of the society. So he counseled us to be very suspicious of new regulations, particularly ones that are proposed from the business community. And as I say, his notion that free markets and free trade do most good to the poorest people. And I think that we saw that during the years of globalization from, I don't know, late 1980s onwards, particularly after 1990. Berlin Wall coming down, all that kind of thing, Asia opening up. And the people who benefited most from that is the world's poorest. That we've almost eliminated dollar-a-day poverty now, and we will have eliminated it in just a few years' time. And that's come not through years and years of socialism, it's come through free trade. Free trade enriches people. You make people rich by buying their stuff. So I think that's also another important lesson for today.
Yes, it's very interesting looking at the poverty issue that's almost disappeared from public view. Whereas I can remember as a child, there was little talked about in so many vestiges, and everything that happened at a prep school or primary school was all oriented towards trying to feed some poor group of people around the world. And television programs for children were all about how poor everybody was on the other side of the world. And yet you look at it today, and while there are genuinely hard cases to be had, I mean, the actual instances of people starving to death as a result of crop failure or other issues is actually incredibly low.
That is true, and part of that is genetically modified crops. It's better understanding of weather, better weather forecasting, things like that, and the fact that people are richer, so they build themselves sturdier houses that don't fall down in earthquakes. So yes, we need to generate wealth in order to get rid of poverty. It stands to reason, and wealth strangely spreads out through the community. It doesn't just stick in the hands of a few rich investors. It goes right through the community and right through the world, in fact. So the best way that we can stamp out poverty is simply to encourage free trade and free commerce. And you're right, when I was born, 4/5 of the world lived in dollar-a-day poverty. Now it's a tiny fraction. And most of that is in sub-Saharan Africa. And other places in Africa are getting wealthier even as we speak. So if we can get rid of, Adam Smith said that all you need to raise a country from destitution to luxury is peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. And if you've got low taxes and you have peace, that is most of it. And extreme poverty tends to be now in the places where there's warfare going on and genocides and ethnic disputes. If we can do something about that, then people will they'll make themselves rich because they'll plant crops knowing that it's not going to be stolen by other guys who come in next year. So people will invest more, and that's exactly what you want them to do.
Yeah. So what other messages, if any, are there that we could take away from Adam Smith that are apt for the world today and we ought to be paying more attention to?
Well, I think if you look at actually both of Smith's book, his moral book and his economics book, they are surprisingly modern in that they take really an evolutionary approach. Now, Smith was writing 100 years before Darwin, so he didn't have The Origin of Species to help him. But I think he and David Hume and other intellectuals of the time in the Scottish Enlightenment knew that there was some reason why good things persisted and bad things died out. And so he takes this evolutionary idea in our morality. He says that the reason that we like to please other people is because providence makes that somehow good for our species. And similarly in economics, he's saying good things will prevail because they will make us rich. And we should identify what it is that makes us rich and do more of it, and identify what it is that makes us poor and do less of it. So I think that there's a sort of general message there to trust free markets, and certainly not to trust politicians and interventionists of all sorts.
Yes, very, very, very apt for the current wave of seemingly almost quasi-endless interventionists that seem to be running so many nations around the world, particularly in the West. It's quite curious. So looking at that, here we are talking about 300 years of Adam Smith, ladies and gentlemen, with the man behind the Adam Smith Institute, Dr. Eamonn Butler. It's a fascinating situation that 3 centuries on, Adam Smith is just so relevant in so many ways, despite the fact that some of the companies and enterprises and philosophies that he talks about, I mean, he goes into great length about fishermen and things like this, which are much less important to the economy these days than they were at that point in time. Nonetheless, he remains so epicentral to what goes on in our lives. How do you work Adam Smith's workings into your everyday work? Or has he been superseded by, or is he merely being complemented by subsequent generations of economists, Eamonn?
No, I think he gives you a general approach for policy in our case. And that, as I said, he says that regulations, for example, should only be accepted after the most scrupulous and indeed suspicious attention. So when regulations are promoted, the first thing I do is to say, well, where does this come from? Who's this actually going to benefit? Is it going to benefit the general public, or is it going to benefit the people who promoted the regulation? And the same with laws, really, of any sort. Is this done in order to make a politician feel good, or is it done for the sake of the nation? So I think that's a very important sort of world view that Adam Smith gives you. But also, you're right about his sympathy for the poorest people, and I think that again gives you a good motivation. What can we do to, never mind people who are okay, and never mind people who are wealthy, they can look after themselves. What can we do that would actually help poorer people? And politicians do stray from this, and they seem to think that, okay, we can put taxes up and we'll say, oh yes, it's only the rich that are going to pay them. But in fact, everybody pays them because if taxes, we have very high corporation tax in the UK at the moment, and you can see businesses leaving the UK because the trading conditions here are not good for them. So by putting up taxes, you actually drive trade away. You drive commerce out of your country, and that reduces the opportunities for everybody, and in particular for the poorest who need opportunities.
Yes, the poor need opportunities at all points in time, and certainly the opportunity to bring them into the economy and therefore grow the economy for everybody remains vital to this day. Obviously, we're very interested in free markets, Eamonn. We're interested in the actual market structures themselves, exchanges and so on. One book that was written about 25 years ago and certainly will never compete with Adam Smith's for relevance, pertinence, or indeed be talked about in 300 years' time, happens to have been Capital Market Revolution, my own original book. And I'm just wondering, I mean, given your background, understanding so much about Adam Smith and the world of policy and making it, and as a person who's run the most esteemed British free market think tank for so long, where do you think the concept of capital market revolutions and fintech and so on go next?
Oh, more and more, I think, is the answer to that. I mean, unless they get stymied by regulation, and protectionism, because I mean, for example, there is strong competition with the Western markets now from Singapore and Shanghai, I suppose, and other Asian centres, and that seems to me can only increase. So there may very well be a notion that, oh well, we need to keep all of this business to ourselves, and you can see this in Europe, where European centres like Paris and so on, in particular, try to arrange the legislation so that you can't do certain sorts of trade in London. That really is outrageous. But otherwise, I think yes, I think the capital markets have made investors more sophisticated. Investors have become more sophisticated, and therefore they're demanding different products and new products. So I think product innovation is going to be extremely important, and I think automation and AI, that's going to change markets. If I knew how, I would be a billionaire, but they will certainly change markets. There's no question about that. So I think it's going to be in a very interesting time.
So product innovation, specialization, free trade, three tenets at the core of Adam Smith's own philosophy from 300 years on. So plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, as I'm sure many people used to say in Kirkcaldy when he was around. It's been a fascinating opportunity to chat about Adam Smith 300 years on, to get a glimpse into the world of policy development from an esteemed think tanker in the epicenter of Whitehall, such as yourself, Dr. Eamonn Butler. I've really appreciated the opportunity to talk. We are fascinated by both his book, which I think still remains such a fascinating tome altogether, The Wealth of Nations, and indeed yours, which we recommend, Foundations of a Free Society, which is a very, very good read, ladies and gentlemen, to understand just how important these little things that actually many of us take for granted, but we don't realize how important they are until, well, the wrong kind of person's trying to sweep it away from us. Let me also say thank you very much to those who participated in the show today. Mark Wheatley, thank you very, very much. Also Peter Secon. Our next show is coming up next week. We're looking forward to talking to a veteran trader from the pits of Chicago to the macroeconomic environments around the world, Ira Harris, and he's going to be telling us patience is a virtue. Stay tuned for that. It's going to be a fascinating show, same time, same place next week, ladies and gentlemen. All it remains for me to say is to thank our production team today. Mary, welcome back, Mary, from maternity leave, Marianne and Janella, and finally, once again, our guest. Check out the work of the Adam Smith Institute, ladies and gentlemen. It really is God's work in terms of sensible, coherent policy that's good for everybody and making us a more prosperous society. And it's led by our guest today, Eamonn Butler. Thank you very, very much for joining us on IPO-VID. My name is Patrick L. Young. If you're still thinking distributed finance, even as fast as the SEC is trying to stop it, I suppose I will wish you a good week in blockchain. But I certainly wish you, come what may, a great week in life and markets.